The blood on the bus floor reached her sneakers before the man's name ever reached her ears. Josephine Hale smelled the copper first, then saw it. A thin dark line tracking from the rear exit door to the seat across the aisle, where a stranger sat with his jaw clenched and one hand pressed hard against his ribs. Rain hammered the windows. The last bus out of downtown Chicago rattled through a red light nobody dared question, and the driver kept glancing in the mirror like he'd rather be anywhere else. Jo's shift at St. Agnes had run 19 hours. Her feet throbbed. Her wallet held $4 and a bus pass that wouldn't renew until Friday. In the bag on her lap sat the only food she had left until payday. Half a turkey sandwich she'd been rationing since noon, and the small bright fact that her nephew Caleb needed his inhaler refilled before Monday, a fact that ate at her more than hunger ever could. The stranger's coat was too thin for October. Under the fluorescent light his knuckles were split. His face pale in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. 2 other passengers had already moved seats. A man near the front had his phone out, not to call for help, to record. Nobody offered a hand. Nobody asked if he was fine. That kind of silence, Jo had learned working the ER, was its own diagnosis. People were afraid of him, not for him. She recognized the shape of that fear even before she understood it. It sat differently than the fear people had of a mugger or a drunk. This was the fear reserved for something organized, something with a name that traveled through a city like a held breath. She didn't know yet that the man bleeding into his own shirt 3 feet away was the reason certain warehouses on the South Side stayed dark at night, the reason 2 judges had resigned rather than rule against a family whose lawyers never lost. She only knew that his hands were shaking the way hands shake when a body is deciding whether to stay conscious. "You're going to pass out," she said, not a question. He didn't answer. His eyes tracked her anyway, sharp, assessing, a man cataloging exits even while dying a little in a bus seat. Jo unwrapped the sandwich. It was the only decision available to her that cost nothing but everything. She tore it in half and held out the larger piece. "Eat something before you fall over. Low blood sugar makes bleeding worse. Trust me, I do this for a living." For 3 full seconds he simply looked at her. The way a man looks at an unfamiliar weapon he isn't sure how to hold. Then he took it. His fingers, when they brushed hers, were freezing. "Why?" he said. One word. Rough, like it cost him something to spend it. "Because you look like nobody's fed you kindness in a long time," Jo said. "Doesn't mean you don't need it." He ate in silence. The bus lurched past a fire hydrant spraying into the gutter, past a black SUV idling at the corner that Jo would later learn had been circling the block for 11 minutes, hunting him. When the stranger finally spoke again, it wasn't thanks. "Get off at the next stop," he said quietly. "Don't look back at this bus. Don't remember my face." Jo almost laughed. That's not really how memory works. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his mouth. "It should be," he said. "For your sake." The bus doors hissed open 2 blocks early. He was gone before she'd finished standing, vanished into the rain and the dark like he'd never bled on her shoes at all, except for the folded $20 bill he'd left on the seat, and the black card beneath it with no name, only a number, and 3 words engraved into the corner: Mafia boss's protection. Jo didn't tell anyone about the card. She buried it in the bottom of her scrubs drawer under a stack of unpaid bills, next to the photograph of her sister Mara, who'd been gone 8 months now, and the inhaler prescription she still owed $40 on. Her life ran on a schedule with no slack in it. 6 a.m. Wake Caleb, check his breathing, make sure the wheeze from his asthma hadn't crept back overnight. 7. Drop him at Mrs. Okafor's before school, since the woman watched him for half what daycare charged and never once complained when Jo was late with payment. Then 12 hours in an ER that never slowed down, patching gunshot wounds and overdoses and the occasional heart attack, all while 3 collection notices sat unopened on her kitchen counter. She had raised Caleb since Mara's accident, a hit and run that the police had closed within a week, calling it random, calling it bad luck, though Joe had never quite believed either word. She'd asked for the case file twice. Both times she'd been told it was sealed. At the hospital, Joe was known for two things: her steadiness under pressure, and her inability to leave an underdog alone. When a homeless veteran came in dehydrated and refused treatment out of pride, Joe was the one who sat with him for an hour until he let her start the 4. When a terrified teenage mother showed up with a baby and no insurance, Joe quietly covered the copay herself, the kind of debt that never appeared on any account. That instinct was what got her noticed. 3 days after the bus, a black car was waiting outside St. Agnes when her shift ended. Not idling threateningly. Parked, patient, its driver reading a newspaper like he had nowhere else to be. When Joe approached the bus stop instead, the man rolled down his window. "Ms. Hale, get in. He wants to thank you properly." "He can send a card," Joe said, already walking faster. "He did," the driver said. "You didn't call the number." That stopped her. She hadn't told anyone the card existed, hadn't spoken its number aloud even to herself. Someone had been watching closely enough to know she hadn't used it, which meant someone had been watching her, period. "Who is he?" she said, not really expecting an answer. "Ask him yourself." The driver nodded toward the corner, where a second darker vehicle idled with its rear door already open, and where the same rain-soaked stranger from the bus stepped out. Dry now, dressed in a charcoal coat that fit like it had never known a wrinkle, flanked by two men who moved like they'd rehearsed staying exactly 3 feet behind him no matter which direction he turned. Joe's stomach dropped. Not from fear exactly. From recognition. The kind that clicks a lock shut on a door you didn't know you'd left open. "You're the Mafia boss," she said. It wasn't posed as a question, because somewhere between the split knuckles and the black card, she'd already known. "Roman Castellano," he said, like the name itself was an apology. "And you're the only person in this city who's fed me without wanting something first. I wanted you to stop bleeding on my shoes." The faint, almost smile returned. "That counts." He told her in careful economical sentences what she needed and nothing more, that the men who'd wounded him belonged to a rival family testing the edges of his territory, that her kindness on that bus had likely saved his life by keeping his blood sugar from crashing before backup arrived, and that in his world, a debt like that didn't go unpaid. He offered money. She refused it. He offered protection. She refused that too, sharper than she meant to. "I don't need saving," she said. "I need you to leave before my neighbors start asking who parks black SUVs on Prescott Street." Roman studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel catalogued rather than seen. "Fine," he said finally. "But you should know, the men who shot me don't forget a face. And now yours is attached to mine, whether either of us wanted it." He left before she could argue, though he paused at the car door long enough to look back once, as if committing the house number to memory the way other men memorized scripture. That night, walking Caleb through his bedtime inhaler ritual, Joe told herself the warning meant nothing. She counted his breaths the way she always did, one hand flat against his small chest, and reminded herself that this was the life she'd built. Small, careful, hers. She had learned a long time ago that the world did not reward people who asked for more than they could hold on to. Mara used to tease her about it, called her the family's designated worrier, the one who read every fine print and double-checked every lock. Joe had thought that caution would be enough to keep Caleb safe. She had thought a lot of things before Mara died and left her the only proof otherwise. She almost believed her own reassurance, right up until the moment 3 days later when a car she didn't recognize idled outside Mrs. Okafor's house for 11 straight minutes, engine running, headlights off, watching the window where her nephew slept. Mrs. Okafor noticed it first, called Joe midshift in a voice pitched too calm to be anything but frightened, and by the time Joe tore off her gloves and sprinted for the parking lot, her hands were shaking in a way they never did over patients, no matter how much blood was involved. The parking lot outside Mrs. Okafor's had already gone quiet by the time Joe arrived, The unfamiliar car nowhere in sight. Caleb asleep and unharmed in his bed with his inhaler still on the nightstand where she'd left it. But quiet, Joe was learning fast, meant nothing in Roman Castellano's world. It just meant the danger hadn't decided to announce itself yet. She called the number on the black card before she'd even caught her breath. Roman answered on the first ring, as though he'd been waiting for it. "Tell me." "A car. 11 minutes outside my nephew's sitter's house. Lights off." Joe's voice cracked on the last word, and she hated herself for it. There was a pause, brief and absolute, the kind of silence that told her more than any explanation could. Then, "Address." "Now." She gave it. 40 minutes later, headlights swept across her own street. Not one car this time, but 4, moving in a loose formation that would have looked, to anyone who didn't understand what they were watching, like nothing more than late-night traffic. To Joe, standing in her doorway with Caleb's hand gripped tight in hers, it looked like a wall going up around her house, brick by brick, without a single word spoken. Roman got out of the second vehicle. He moved differently now than he had on the bus. No wounds slowing him, no need to hide what he was. 2 men fell into step 3 feet behind him without being told, the same rehearsed distance Joe had noticed outside the hospital, and a third peeled off toward the tree line at the edge of the yard without any order at all, already scanning the dark for whatever had circled her nephew's window like it was prey. "You didn't need to bring an army," Joe said, though her voice shook on the word. "I brought exactly enough," Roman said. "Whoever sat outside that house tonight wasn't guessing where to find you. They knew. Which means someone talked or someone followed. And either way, this stopped being a coincidence 3 days ago on that bus. What does that mean for him?" Joe nodded toward Caleb, who watched the black-clad men with wide, silent eyes, the particular stillness of a child who has already learned, too young, not to ask questions during the scary parts. Roman crouched to Caleb's height without being asked, which surprised Joe more than the convoy had. "Nobody touches him," he said to the boy directly, not over his head the way most adults spoke around children. "Not while I'm breathing. You understand me?" Caleb, solemn, nodded like he'd just been handed a contract he intended to hold someone to. Joe watched something in Roman's face flicker and vanish. Grief, maybe, or its shadow, gone before she could name it. She would learn later that he'd once made a promise almost identical to a child who hadn't lived to see it kept. For now, she only registered that the Mafia boss standing in her yard, surrounded by armed men and radiating a kind of authority that made grown security guards straighten their spines 3 blocks away, had just made a vow to a 7-year-old like it mattered more than anything else he owned. "Who's after you?" Joe said. "Really? Not the version you tell people to keep them calm." Roman straightened, and for a moment the warmth toward Caleb closed back into something colder, more calculated. "The Falcone family," he said. "They've wanted my territory for 6 years and my life for longer than that. I embarrassed their underboss in a deal that cost them the Western docks. They don't forgive embarrassment. And me. Why does any of that reach me? Because you fed a stranger on a bus without asking who he was," Roman said. "And in my world, that kind of decency gets photographed, tracked, and used as leverage the second anyone with eyes realizes I'd burn my own empire down before I let anything happen to you." The words landed harder than Joe expected, half warning and half confession, and she didn't have an answer ready for either one. Behind them, one of Roman's men murmured something into a radio, low and clipped, and the tree line went quiet again. Whatever had been watching from the dark had already slipped away, leaving nothing behind but a single cigarette but still smoking against the wet grass, an object Roman's men bagged without a word, like evidence they already expected to need. "I'm putting a car on this street," Roman said. "Every night. No arguments." Joe opened her mouth to argue anyway, and found, for the first time in 8 months of carrying everything alone, that she didn't actually want to. She sent Caleb back to bed with a nightlight and a promise that the men outside were friends, a lie that felt smaller than most lies she'd told him since Mara died. When she came back downstairs, Roman was still standing in her kitchen doorway, studying the collection notices on the counter with an expression he didn't bother to hide. "You could let me help," he said quietly. "I don't want your money. I didn't offer money." He nodded toward the stack of bills. "I offered to make one phone call. The hospital administrator who keeps denying your overtime requests owes a debt to a man who owes me a favor. It costs you nothing. That's not how the world is supposed to work." "No," Roman agreed. "But it's how it does work for people like me. And tonight it's working in your favor instead of against it. You can be proud later. Tonight, let it help your nephew." Joe didn't answer, but she didn't throw him out either, and something about the silence between them felt like the first honest conversation she'd had in months. Not because either of them said everything, but because neither of them pretended the danger outside her window was smaller than it was. Roman left before midnight, but the black car he promised was already parked across the street by the time his taillights disappeared around the corner, engine idling low, headlights dark, a silent line drawn between her family and whatever had been circling it in the dark. The black car became a fixture on Prescott Street the way the streetlight had always been. Expected, then invisible, then simply part of the neighborhood's geography. 2 weeks passed with no further incidents, which should have felt like relief. Instead it felt like held breath. Joe saw Roman 4 more times in those 2 weeks, and each visit chipped away at the version of him she'd built from that first bus ride. Dangerous, distant, a problem to be managed rather than a man to be known. He showed up once with a mechanic to fix her car's dead battery without being asked, standing at a careful distance while the man worked, arms crossed, watching the street instead of her, the way a guard watches a perimeter instead of the thing he's guarding. He showed up once at 2 in the morning after a call from his own men that something had shifted near the docks, and stayed only long enough to confirm Caleb was breathing evenly before leaving again without explanation. "You don't have to check on him every time something happens across town," Joe said, the 3rd time she caught him standing in the hallway outside Caleb's door. "I do," Roman said. "That's the part you don't understand yet. Once I decided you mattered, everything that matters to you became mine to protect. I don't get to turn that off because it's inconvenient. That's not protection. That's ownership." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and controlled, like a man recalibrating an argument he'd expected to win. "Maybe," he admitted. "I've never had to learn the difference. Nobody's ever asked me to. I'm asking." He didn't answer that night, but the question stayed lodged between them, resurfacing every time his men repositioned without her permission, every time a decision about her own safety got made 3 steps ahead of her and delivered as a fact rather than a choice. Joe pushed back harder than she expected to. She told him flatly that she'd raised Caleb alone through the worst year of her life without needing an underboss to reroute her schedule, and that his money couldn't buy the one thing she actually needed from him, which was to be asked instead of informed. Roman listened. That, more than the convoy or the black card or the impossible eyes that tracked every room he entered, was what convinced Joe he was capable of more than the reputation attached to his name. He didn't argue back. He recalculated out loud in front of her, admitting that a man who built an empire on controlling every variable had never once considered that the woman he was trying to protect might need control of her own variables more than she needed his. The tenderness, when it came, arrived sideways, not through declarations but through small adjustments. He started calling before he sent anyone to her street instead of simply sending them. He asked instead of assumed whether Caleb liked baseball before showing up with tickets. He noticed, without being told, that Joe hadn't slept properly in a week, and left a thermos of coffee on her porch with no card attached, because by then he'd learned she didn't want his money attached to anything that felt like a gift. The danger noticed the shift too. It came from Nico Salvatore first, Roman's own underboss, a man Joe had met exactly twice and distrusted both times for reasons she couldn't articulate until later. He arrived at the house on a night Roman was handling business across the city, ostensibly to deliver an update, though his eyes lingered too long on the family photographs on Joe's mantel, on the framed picture of Mara, on the child's shoes lined up by the door. "He's never let anyone this close before," Nico said, watching her the way a man studies a variable he hasn't accounted for. "Not since Elena." Joe didn't recognize the name, and something in Nico's face, a flicker of satisfaction at having said it, at watching her not know, told her the omission had been deliberate on Roman's part. "Who's Elena?" "Ask Roman," Nico said, already turning toward the door, voice light in a way that felt calculated rather than careless. "Ask him what happened to the last person who fed him kindness for free." The words sat in Joe's chest like a stone through dinner, through Caleb's bedtime, through the hour she spent staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. When Roman finally called near midnight, she asked him directly, the way she'd learned to ask him everything now. No hedging, no softening. "Who's Elena?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that Joe thought the call had dropped. "Not tonight," Roman said finally, and something in his voice had gone somewhere Joe hadn't heard it go before. Not cold but hollowed out, a man walking carefully around a wound he'd spent years pretending had closed. "I'll tell you." Not over a phone. And not because Nico decided you deserved to hear it from him first. He shouldn't have brought it up at all. "No," Roman agreed, quiet and sharp at once. "He shouldn't have." That same week, a nurse 3 floors down from Joe's ward reported her supply cabinet keys missing for 6 hours before they reappeared, untouched, in the exact drawer where they belonged. Joe would only understand months later that the missing hours had been enough time for someone to photograph every medication log with her name on it, enough time to learn exactly which shifts she worked alone, and exactly which nights her nephew stayed at Mrs. Okafor's without a black car parked outside. The same week brought a smaller, sharper cruelty too. A man at the hospital cafeteria, well-dressed, unfamiliar, who sat too close to Joe's table and made a point of mentioning Roman's name like a threat disguised as small talk, asking whether she knew what happened to women who got too comfortable near powerful men. Joe didn't flinch, though her pulse spiked hard enough that she counted her own breaths to steady it, an old trick from nursing school. She reported the encounter to no one but Roman, expecting caution, a warning, maybe another car. Instead, the man never returned to that cafeteria, or to the neighborhood where he'd been renting an apartment, or to any restaurant within 6 blocks of St. Agnes. Joe never asked what happened to him. Roman never offered details. But 2 of his men began appearing at her hospital's parking structure at the end of every shift after that, standing at a respectful distance, saying nothing, simply present. The quiet, absolute language of a man who had decided, without asking her permission this time, that some threats didn't deserve the courtesy of negotiation. Joe noticed the contradiction and said nothing about it either. Not yet, though she filed it away the way she filed away every other piece of evidence that the boundary between protection and possession, in Roman Castellano's world, was thinner than either of them wanted to admit. Roman came to her house 2 nights later carrying a manila folder instead of coffee. And Joe knew before he said a word that this was the conversation he'd postponed on the phone. "Elena was my wife," he said before she could ask again. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, watching the street the way he always did, as though the confession might require an exit route. 6 years ago. She wasn't part of this life when I met her. A schoolteacher, uninvolved, the kind of woman the Falcones would have called soft. She fed a stranger once too. Different circumstances. Same instinct. I fell for her the same way I'm falling for you. And I told myself the same lie both times. That kindness like that could exist inside my world without being used against it. What happened to her? The Falcones found out I'd married her without telling anyone. They saw a weakness where I saw the only good thing I'd ever built. They took her instead of coming after me directly, because they understood something I hadn't let myself understand. That killing me would have made me a martyr, but destroying what I loved would make me useless for the rest of my life. Roman's voice didn't rise. It went flatter instead. The practiced flatness of a man who had rehearsed this story silently for years so it would never come out sounding like what it actually was. I got her back. Too late. She died in a hospital 3 floors below the one you work in now. In a bed 2 nurses down the hall from where you clock in every morning. The room tilted slightly around Joe, 3 separate facts locking into place at once. The way Roman had known exactly which hospital she worked at before she'd ever told him. The way his eyes had lingered too long on her ID badge the first time she'd shown it to prove she was a nurse and not something more dangerous. The way he'd flinched, almost imperceptibly, the first night he'd stood in her kitchen and seen the framed photograph of her sister on the mantel. You knew, Joe said slowly. Before the bus. You already knew who I was. Roman didn't deny it. I didn't board that bus by accident, he said. I've had people watching St. Agnes for years quietly because Elena died there and because some part of me needed to know the place that killed her was still standing, still functioning, still saving people the way it failed to save her. Your name came up 18 months ago. The nurse who covered a stranger's copay, who sat with a dying veteran for an hour past her shift, who never once asked for credit. I told myself I was only curious. I told myself a lot of things. And Mara. Joe's voice had gone very quiet, the particular stillness of someone circling a truth they already suspected and dreaded. My sister's accident. The one the police called random. You knew about that too. Roman's silence answered before his words did. The driver who hit her worked for the Falcons, he said finally. Not because of you, because of me. Mara had started asking questions about a shipment that moved through a warehouse she managed inventory for, 3 blocks from Falcon territory. She found something she shouldn't have. I believe, though I can't prove it yet, that she found evidence connecting the Falcons to a shipment I'd been building a case against for 2 years, the same case that nearly got me killed on that bus. They silenced her before she could bring it to anyone. And I didn't know until 3 weeks ago that the woman who fed me a sandwich, the woman I'd been quietly falling for, was the sister of a woman my own war had gotten killed. Joe stood, chest heaving, the sandwich, the black card, the parked cars, the sudden intervention at Mrs. Okafor's house, all rearranging themselves into a shape she hadn't let herself see. You let me believe it was random, she said. For 8 months, I told Caleb his mother's death was bad luck. You knew it wasn't, and you said nothing. And then you sat in my kitchen offering to fix my problems like some kind of penance. I was going to tell you, Roman said. I was building the proof first so you'd have more than my word. So the men who did this would actually pay instead of simply being named. I know that reason sounds like an excuse now. It probably is one. It is one. Joe's hands were shaking, and this time it had nothing to do with fear. You don't get to decide when I learn the truth about my own sister to protect your timeline. You're right. Roman didn't defend himself further, didn't soften it, didn't reach for her the way she half expected him to. I built an empire on deciding things for other people before they could decide for themselves. It's the only method I know. It got Elena killed just as surely as the Falcons did, because I decided she needed protecting instead of asking what protection she actually wanted. I told myself I'd learned that lesson. I clearly hadn't, not all the way. The folder in his hand, when he finally set it on her counter, contained photographs Joe would spend the rest of the night unable to stop looking at. Surveillance images of the same black SUV that had idled outside Mrs. Okafor's house, time-stamped 8 months earlier, parked half a block from the intersection where Mara had died. Partial license plate. A grainy still of a driver's face that matched, unmistakably, a man Joe had seen twice before at Roman's side, standing 3 feet behind him with the same rehearsed patience as every other soldier in his crew. Nico, Joe said, the name arriving in her mouth like a diagnosis she hadn't wanted to confirm. Roman's jaw tightened, the first crack Joe had seen in his composure since the bus. I don't know that yet, he said. But I intend to. Joe picked the folder back up before Roman could close it, some old instinct refusing to let a detail go unexamined simply because the story around it hurt. She'd spent 6 years reading charts under fluorescent lights until pattern recognition became less a skill than a reflex. Dosage errors buried in decimal points, vital signs that lied until you cross-referenced 3 separate readings, Symptoms that made no sense until you noticed the one lab value everyone else had skimmed past. She laid the surveillance photograph side by side on her kitchen table now, the way she'd once laid 3 months of a patient's charts side by side to catch a slow-bleeding internal injury 4 other nurses had missed. "This timestamp," she said slowly, tapping one photograph, "doesn't match the others. Everything here is dated to the week before Mara died. This one's dated 2 days after. Which means whoever took these wasn't just watching the warehouse. They kept watching after she was already gone." Roman went still in a way that told Joe she'd found something even his own surveillance team had overlooked. "Show me." "They were watching to see if anyone came looking," Joe said, the realization arriving whole, unbidden, in the particular way a diagnosis sometimes did. Not built logically step by step, but simply present all at once, obvious in retrospect. Someone wanted to know if Mara had told anyone else what she'd found before they silenced her. That's not the surveillance pattern of a hit. That's the pattern of a cover-up still checking for loose ends. Roman looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite pride, closer to the specific unsettled respect of a man watching someone solve a problem his entire organization had spent months circling. "You see things," he said. "The way you saw the blood on that bus before anyone else even smelled it." "I read people's bodies for a living," Joe said. "Turns out that translates." Somewhere in the house, Caleb coughed once in his sleep. An ordinary sound, harmless, the kind of small noise a healthy child makes 50 times a night. And both of them turned toward the stairs at exactly the same moment, the same fear rising in each of them at once, though neither said the word out loud. The call came at 3:14 in the morning, 4 days after the folder had sat open on Joe's kitchen table. Mrs. Okafor's voice on the phone was barely a whisper, and beneath it, Joe could hear the particular silence of a house that had just had its front door forced open. "He's gone," Mrs. Okafor said. "Caleb. I only left him for a minute, the bathroom, I swear to you." Joe was already moving, phone wedged against her shoulder, pulling scrubs over the clothes she'd slept in, screaming Roman's number into the dial pad before Mrs. Okafor even finished the sentence. By the time she reached the house, the black car that had guarded her street for 3 weeks straight sat empty at the curb, its driver slumped against the wheel, unconscious but breathing, a thin line of blood at his temple where something blunt had found him from behind. Roman arrived within 11 minutes, the exact same interval, Joe would realize later, that the mystery SUV had once idled outside this same house watching a sleeping child. His face, when he stepped out of the car, had gone somewhere Joe had never seen it go. Not the cold authority of the man in her kitchen, not the tenderness of the man who'd learned to ask before assuming. Something underneath both of those, older and rawer, the face of a man watching the same nightmare happen twice. "The guard's been drugged, not killed," Roman said, crouching over the unconscious driver with 2 fingers pressed to his throat. "That's deliberate. Whoever did this wanted him alive to identify them later, which means they're either arrogant enough not to care, or they knew he wouldn't be able to identify anyone at all. Which is it?" Roman's jaw worked once before he answered. "It's someone who knew exactly where every camera on this street was pointed. Someone who knew the guard's rotation schedule down to the minute. Someone who's had access to my operation long enough to learn things even I don't share with outsiders." The word neither of them wanted to say arrived anyway, dragged into the open by the evidence itself. Nico Salvatore had missed 2 check-in calls that night. Nico Salvatore had been the one who arranged the guard rotation for Prescott Street. Nico Salvatore had stood in Joe's kitchen 3 weeks earlier and planted Elena's name like a blade meant to test how deep loyalty ran before deciding whether it was worth breaking. "He's had access to everything," Roman said, voice gone hollow in a way Joe had only heard once before, the night he told her about Elena. "Every schedule, every safe house, every promise I made you about keeping your street guarded. I trusted him with the details that could hurt you most. Because I trusted him with my life for 11 years before I trusted anyone with yours." "Why would he take Caleb?" Joe said, though some cold, clinical part of her mind had already assembled an answer she didn't want to say out loud first. Roman said it instead. Because Caleb isn't just your nephew to him. He's leverage against me and evidence against the Falcons at the same time. If Mara really did find what I think she found and passed even a fragment of it to her son before she died. Nico spent 11 years positioning himself as my most trusted man while quietly building a second loyalty to the Falcons underneath it, feeding them just enough to stay useful, waiting for the moment it would pay off bigger than staying loyal to me ever could. This is that moment. A folded note waited on the porch step, weighted down by a single brass button Joe recognized instantly, torn from the strap of Caleb's inhaler bag, the one he never went anywhere without. The message inside was 4 lines long, precise, merciless. Bring the shipment ledger Mara Hale died trying to expose. Bring it to the old grain terminal on the river by 6 a.m. Come alone. And the boy stays breathing exactly as long as everyone follows instructions. I don't have a ledger, Joe said, panic climbing her throat. I don't know what she found. I never even knew there was anything to find until 4 days ago. I know, Roman said. But Nico doesn't care whether you have it. He cares whether I believe you might, because that belief is enough to walk me into a trap alone, unarmed, without the backup that's kept me alive for 15 years. Something in the way he said it, resigned, already calculating the terms of his own sacrifice, told Joe exactly what he intended to do, and exactly how little he intended to discuss it with her first. You are not walking in there alone, she said. I am, Roman said. Because the alternative is Nico deciding a 7-year-old isn't worth keeping alive the second he realizes there's no ledger to trade for. And if you die in there, what happens to Caleb then? What happens to me? Joe's voice cracked on the last word, the first time she'd let it since Mara's funeral. You don't get to protect me by disappearing into the one decision I have zero say in. Not after everything you said about learning the difference. Roman looked at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes that had nothing to do with Nico or the ledger or the deadline ticking toward 6 a.m. Then tell me what you need, he said, quiet, almost afraid of the answer. Because I don't know how to do this the way you're asking me to. I've never done it this way in my life. I need you to let me come, Joe said. Not because I have a weapon or a plan. Because I'm the only person in this who Nico doesn't think is dangerous. Which means I'm the only one who can get close enough to actually see what he's really planning before he decides to kill either of you. Roman's silence stretched long enough that Joe thought he might refuse outright. The old instinct to decide everything for her surging back exactly when it mattered least to lose. Then finally he exhaled. The sound of a man setting down a weapon he'd carried his entire adult life. Stay behind the tree line until I signal, he said. That's not me deciding for you. That's me asking you to trust that I know this terminal better than anyone alive who isn't already inside it. Before they left, Roman made one call. Not to his soldiers, but to a woman named Renata Cruz, a retired detective who had spent a decade building the exact kind of case against the Falcons that Mara Hale had died trying to hand someone. Renata had been the one person outside Roman's organization he trusted with a surveillance folder, the one person whose testimony could turn Mara's death from an unsolved hit and run into evidence a courtroom might actually recognize. Joe was already moving, phone wedged against her shoulder, pulling scrubs over the clothes she'd slept in, screaming Roman's number into the dial pad before Mrs. Okafor even finished the sentence. By the time she reached the house, the black car that had guarded her street for 3 weeks straight sat empty at the curb, its driver slumped against the wheel, unconscious but breathing, a thin line of blood at his temple where something blunt had found him from behind. Roman arrived within 11 minutes, the exact same interval. Joe would realize later that the mystery SUV had once idled outside this same house watching a sleeping child. His face, when he stepped out of the car, had gone somewhere Joe had never seen it go. Not the cold authority of the man in her kitchen, not the tenderness of the man who'd learned to ask before assuming. Something underneath both of those, older and rawer, the face of a man watching the same nightmare happen twice. The guard's been drugged, not killed, Roman said, crouching over the unconscious driver with 2 fingers pressed to his throat. That's deliberate. Whoever did this wanted him alive to identify them later, which means they're either arrogant enough not to care, or they knew he wouldn't be able to identify anyone at all. Which is it? Roman's jaw worked once before he answered. It's someone who knew exactly where every camera on the street was pointed. Someone who knew the guard's rotation schedule down to the minute. Someone who's had access to my operation long enough to learn things even I don't share with outsiders. The word neither of them wanted to say arrived anyway, dragged into the open by the evidence itself. Nico Salvatore had missed 2 check-in calls that night. Nico Salvatore had been the one who arranged the guard rotation for Prescott Street. Nico Salvatore had stood in Joe's kitchen 3 weeks earlier and planted Elena's name like a blade meant to test how deep loyalty ran before deciding whether it was worth breaking. He's had access to everything, Roman said, voice gone hollow in a way Joe had only heard once before, the night he told her about Elena. Every schedule, every safe house, every promise I made you about keeping your street guarded. I trusted him with the details that could hurt you most. Because I trusted him with my life for 11 years before I trusted anyone with yours. Why would he take Caleb? Joe said, though some cold, clinical part of her mind had already assembled an answer she didn't want to say out loud first. Roman said it instead. Because Caleb isn't just your nephew to him. He's leverage against me and evidence against the Falcones at the same time. If Mara really did find what I think she found and passed even a fragment of it to her son before she died. Nico spent 11 years positioning himself as my most trusted man while quietly building a second loyalty to the Falcones underneath it, feeding them just enough to stay useful, waiting for the moment it would pay off bigger than staying loyal to me ever could. This is that moment. A folded note waited on the porch step, weighted down by a single brass button Joe recognized instantly. Torn from the strap of Caleb's inhaler bag, the one he never went anywhere without. The message inside was 4 lines long, precise, merciless. Bring the shipment ledger Mara Hale died trying to expose. Bring it to the old grain terminal on the river by 6 a.m. Come alone. And the boy stays breathing exactly as long as everyone follows instructions. I don't have a ledger, Joe said, panic climbing her throat. I don't know what she found. I never even knew there was anything to find until 4 days ago. I know, Roman said. But Nico doesn't care whether you have it. He cares whether I believe you might, because that belief is enough to walk me into a trap alone, unarmed, without the backup that's kept me alive for 15 years. Something in the way he said it, resigned, already calculating the terms of his own sacrifice, told Joe exactly what he intended to do, and exactly how little he intended to discuss it with her first. You are not walking in there alone, she said. I am, Roman said. Because the alternative is Nico deciding a 7-year-old isn't worth keeping alive the second he realizes there's no ledger to trade for. And if you die in there, what happens to Caleb then? What happens to me? Joe's voice cracked on the last word. The first time she'd let it since Mara's funeral. You don't get to protect me by disappearing into the one decision I have 0 say in. Not after everything you said about learning the difference. Roman looked at her for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes that had nothing to do with Nico or the ledger or the deadline ticking toward 6 a.m. Then tell me what you need, he said, quiet, almost afraid of the answer. Because I don't know how to do this the way you're asking me to. I've never done it this way in my life. I need you to let me come, Joe said. Not because I have a weapon or a plan. Because I'm the only person in this who Nico doesn't think is dangerous. Which means I'm the only one who can get close enough to actually see what he's really planning before he decides to kill either of you. Roman's silence stretched long enough that Joe thought he might refuse outright. The old instinct to decide everything for her surging back exactly when it mattered least to lose. Then finally he exhaled. The sound of a man setting down a weapon he'd carried his entire adult life. Stay behind the tree line until I signal, he said. That's not me deciding for you. That's me asking you to trust that I know this terminal better than anyone alive who isn't already inside it. Before they left, Roman made one call. Not to his soldiers, but to a woman named Renata Cruz, a retired detective who had spent a decade building the exact kind of case against the Falcones that Mara Hale had died trying to hand someone. Renata had been the one person outside Roman's organization he trusted with a surveillance folder. The one person whose testimony could turn Mara's death from an unsolved hit and run into evidence a courtroom might actually recognize. "You're wrong about the ledger," Joe said, loud enough to carry. Steady enough that neither man could tell it was a lie assembled in the half-second it took to speak it. "Mara didn't lose it. She gave it to me 8 months ago, the week before she died. Told me to keep it somewhere nobody would think to look. I've had it this whole time. I just didn't know what I was looking at until 4 days ago." Nico's grip on Caleb's shoulder tightened, his eyes narrowing with a particular hunger of a man who suddenly believed the entire equation had shifted back in his favor. "Where?" "Somewhere you'll never find without me," Joe said. "Which means you need me alive at least until you have it. Which means right now, you're not actually in control of anything at all." It was a gamble built on nothing but the 10 seconds of thinking she'd had to construct it, but Joe had learned something in 6 years of emergency medicine that translated more precisely to this moment than she could have guessed. People revealed their true priorities the instant you threatened to take away the thing they believed they already had secured. Nico's hand shifted off Caleb's shoulder for exactly 1/2 second, weight redistributing toward Joe. Attention splitting in a way it hadn't split in the 90 seconds since they'd arrived. That half-second was enough. Caleb slid sideways off the crate the moment the grip loosened, small and quick and already moving toward the service door before anyone could react, the exact exit he'd been quietly angling toward since Joe first stepped into view. Roman moved in the same instant, closing the last 6 feet between himself and Nico with a speed that belonged to a younger, more violent version of the man Joe had watched learn to knock before entering her kitchen. The fight that followed lasted under a minute, brutal and economical, Roman disarming Nico's reach for a weapon with the same controlled precision he brought to every decision Joe had watched him make since the bus. No wasted motion, no unnecessary cruelty. Simply the absolute certainty of a man who had spent 15 years surviving exactly this kind of moment. Nico went down hard against the concrete, and 4 of Roman's men, who had been holding position beyond the tree line exactly as long as Joe had, closed in from the shadows the instant Roman's raised hand gave the signal he'd promised her earlier. "Nobody touches her," Roman said, standing over Nico with his chest heaving, the same 4 words he'd once spoken to a frightened 7-year-old in Joe's front yard, except this time aimed at the man who'd broken every promise those words were meant to protect. "Not the boy. Not Joe. Not anyone this family has left to lose." Nico, bloodied and pinned, still found the breath to laugh, low and bitter. "You think this ends it? The Falcones don't need me anymore. They'll find someone else willing to sell you out for half what I was offered." "Maybe," Roman said. "But it won't be tonight, and it won't be through my own house again, because I'm done letting the people I trust decide when to become the people I fear." Joe reached Caleb at the service door before he'd made it 3 steps further, pulling him into a grip so tight he made a small surprised sound against her shoulder. His zip-tied wrists still bound but his breathing, when she pressed her palm flat against his chest the way she always did, steady and even and entirely his own. "You watched me count exits," she said into his hair, half laugh and half sob. "You actually watched me do that." "You always do it," Caleb said, small and matter-of-fact, already recovering with the particular resilience children carry that adults spend a lifetime trying to relearn. "I figured it was important." Behind them, Roman's men were already securing Nico, already making the calls that would put Renata Cruz's decade of patient casework into motion against the Falcone family before the sun fully cleared the horizon. Roman crossed the loading dock slowly, blood on his knuckles again for the 2nd time since Joe had known him, and knelt in front of Caleb exactly as he had in her front yard 3 weeks earlier. "I told you nobody touches you while I'm breathing," he said. "I meant it then. I mean it more now." Caleb, still catching his breath, still gripping a fistful of Joe's shirt, studied Roman for a long moment with the same solemn weight he'd given him the first night they'd met. "You're bleeding again," he said finally, echoing the exact words Joe had spoken to Roman on a bus 6 weeks earlier. And something in Roman's face broke open at the small, unconscious circle the boy had just closed without knowing it. "I am," Roman said, voice rough. "Somebody should probably do something about that." Joe reached for the first aid kit she'd carried out of habit and out of hope, and began, right there on the loading dock as the sky over the river finally broke into full morning light, to tend the wound the way she'd tended his very first one. Not because he'd asked, and not because he'd paid her, but because it was simply entirely who she was. 2 federal agents arrived within the hour, summoned by Renata Cruz before the sun had fully cleared the water tower at the terminal's edge. And Joe watched Roman surrender Nico into their custody with a calm that surprised her more than the fight had. He didn't argue for a private reckoning. He didn't ask his men to make the problem disappear the way she half expected a man in his position might. Instead, he handed over the surveillance folder himself, every photograph, every timestamp, the partial license plate that had led them here, and said only that he wanted the case built clean enough that no defense attorney the Falcones hired could ever unravel it. "You could have made this easier," one of the agents said, studying him with open suspicion. "Men like you don't usually hand over evidence against your own operation." "This isn't my operation," Roman said. "Not the parts that hurt her family. I want the Doc's case airtight, and I want it to include everything Mara Hale died trying to expose, filed under her name, not mine. She did the work. She should get the credit, even if it's 8 months too late for her to see it." The agents took Nico away in the back of an unmarked car as the last of the fog burned off the river, and for a moment the terminal held nothing but the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning. Gulls somewhere overhead, a barge horn sounding twice in the distance, the small, steady rhythm of Caleb's breathing evening out against Joe's shoulder as the adrenaline finally released its grip on both of them. "It's not over," Roman said quietly, to Joe more than to anyone else. "The Falcones will find someone else. There will be more mornings like this one before this ends completely." "I know," Joe said. "But this morning Caleb's safe. Mara finally has her name on something true. And you didn't have to become someone I couldn't recognize to make it happen. That's more than I thought either of us would get when that note showed up on my porch." 6 months later, the trial against the Falcone family's Doc's operation opened in a federal courtroom downtown, built on evidence filed under a name the prosecutor read aloud on the first day. Mara Hale, whose quiet, careful documentation of a shipment she was never supposed to notice had finally, posthumously, done exactly what she died trying to do. Joe sat in the gallery every day of testimony she could get free from her shifts. Caleb beside her in a small borrowed suit. He outgrew twice before the verdict came in. Roman didn't sit beside them. He'd insisted on that distance himself, the first real boundary he'd ever drawn around his own instincts rather than around Joe's. A Mafia boss's presence in the gallery, he said, would only give the defense something to point at, and this case belonged to Mara, not to him. He watched from outside the courthouse instead, and when the verdict finally came down, guilty on every count that mattered, he was the one who cried first, quietly, in a stairwell where he thought no one could see him do it. He had changed by then, in ways that showed up in small decisions rather than grand gestures. He'd handed control of 2 of his more legitimate holdings to men he trusted completely, using the profits to seed a foundation in Mara's name, one that funded literacy programs and asthma care for children in neighborhoods the city's larger charities had quietly stopped visiting years ago. He still kept a car on Prescott Street some nights, but he asked first now, every time, and accepted it without argument the handful of times Joe said no. The possessive words never fully left him. Some nights, watching her across a room, he still called her his in a low voice meant only for her, still tightened at the edges when another man's attention lingered too long at the hospital fundraiser where she introduced him, for the first time, simply as Roman, no title attached. But the claim had changed shape completely by then. It arrived now only after she'd been given every real chance to walk away and hadn't taken it, after months of watching him ask rather than decide, After he'd stood in a federal courtroom's parking lot and told a room full of agents to build the case against his own world instead of protecting it. "Mine," he said once, quietly, at her sister's grave, the first time they visited together, Caleb between them holding a fistful of the wildflowers Mara used to grow on her windowsill. "Yours," Jo said back, the first time she'd ever returned the word instead of pushing it away. "Because I choose it. Not because you decided it for me." He nodded like a man accepting a verdict he genuinely feared might not come. Caleb's asthma had improved enough by spring that his inhaler sat mostly unused in a kitchen drawer instead of clutched in a small, anxious hand, and some nights now he fell asleep not counting exits out of habit, but simply because he was a child who finally felt, in the small, ordinary way that mattered most, safe. He still remembered the grain terminal in fragments, the way children remember frightening things. Not as trauma exactly, but as the moment he'd learned his aunt could do something extraordinary with something as small as a sandwich and a decision to see a stranger as a person first. Jo thought about that bus ride often, the $4 in her wallet, the rationed half sandwich she'd nearly kept for herself out of exhaustion instead of kindness. She had never once regretted giving it away. Not through the surveillance, not through the danger, not even through the worst night of her life at that terminal by the river. If you had been on that bus, and the man across the aisle was bleeding and afraid and utterly unlike anyone you'd ever call safe, would you have shared what little you had left? Or would you have looked away, the way everyone else on that bus chose to? Some choices cost nothing and change everything. Jo Hale learned that on a rainy bus with $4 to her name, and she'd make the same choice again tomorrow, no matter who turned out to be sitting across the aisle.